We will go ahead and get started with the introductions here. But first, I wanted to welcome you all to the America's Public Forum program. Thank you for all of those of you who are returning to this. As a lot of you know, this is a program that we started last year as a way to do more national events. Hitting more interesting topics and more deep topics than we had done previously in some ways. But this is also a way, and this is the way I've always conceived it. Braver Angels has been very good at grassroots work. Braver Angels has been very, very good at depolarization work. A lot of the things we do in our debates program, a lot of the things we do in our workshops program are really wonderful things to do. And those are the kind of classic archetypal Braver Angels events. But we haven't always done a lot of deep engagement inside the policy world. We haven't always done a lot of deep engagement inside the world of people who write for high-end policy magazines that are read by congressional staffers and think tankers and policy operatives alike, and sometimes have the capability of moving the needle and changing opinion among America's political types on various things. And so the America's Public Forum program was envisioned, number one, as a way to bring in a kind of a speaker program as well as the citizens level discourse programs, but also as a way to kind of bridge the worlds of depolarization at a grassroots level and deep intellectual policy study at an institutional level. And in a sense, bring the world of depolarization to policy intellectuals and bring the world of policy intellectuals to the world of grassroots depolarization. Kind of a bridge between the worlds, and it's a work in progress, but it has been a very rewarding thing to be able to do, and I'm honored to be one of the ones in charge of it. So on behalf of Braver Angels, welcome to America's Public Forum, and looking forward to having a good conversation with you all this evening. But meantime, let's get started with the topic of this evening. So the title of this event obviously was Party Factions, Multi-Party System, Beyond Two-Party Polarization. And it is something that is near and dear to a lot of our hearts here at Braver Angels, because here at Braver Angels, obviously we follow what's called the red-blue rule, right? In questions of leadership, in questions of staffing, in questions of general organizational decision-making, we've always followed the rule that you take equal numbers of reds and blues in leadership, and that's one of the ways that you encourage this true depolarization work in decision-making. But there always has been the question: what is a red? What is a blue? It's pretty obvious in a cultural sense and an institutional sense that red and blue do actually mean something. Red and blue in America do exist, but you also run into the question of not all reds are like all other reds, and not all blues are like other blues. And then there are some folks, they're rarer, I think, than one would think, but there are folks who don't really easily or neatly fit into the red-blue dichotomy. And there's a reason for that. And the reason for that is, as our three speakers have argued eloquently in their recent books, which I'll give you a quick brief about in a moment. American politics is also a very pluralistic kind of hearth, right? There are a lot of different interest groups. There are a lot of different ideological groups. There are a lot of different ways of looking at the world that usually do wind up sorting themselves into a two-party system under the structure that we have, and the structure that we've had for a long time. But they don't always necessarily make complete red-blue, yes-no kind of sense, right? And the political party system itself has always kind of been in tension with that and with the real diversity of American politics, but also some of the imperatives that have made polarized two-party politics just the norm. And so our guests today are all distinguished political scientists who have written many histories and many policy studies on a variety of subjects, but some of their most recent work, and in my opinion, some of their most fascinating work, has been on this question of the two-party system. And the question of how the two-party system and how the party system in general engages with that natural pluralism inside American political institutions. And so if you can't tell yet, I am fascinated in this subject. This is something that is near and dear to my heart, and I'm just so excited that we've been able to cobble together this panel to talk about this, because it's something that, after having gone through the 2020 election, even after having gone through the 2016 election, and with the 2022 primaries and elections and the 2024 primaries coming up reasonably shortly, I think there's never been a better time to talk about the question of the recent American political party system and how it exists, and if it is truly representative or not, and maybe some questions of how it might be reformed. And I am just honored to be joined by the distinguished panel we have here today. So let me introduce them to you, and then we'll hop into the conversation. So our first speaker is Lee Drutman. Lee, if you can just say hi to everybody real quick.
Hi to everybody.
Thank you, Lee. Lee is a senior fellow at the think tank New America in Washington, D.C. And he's the senior fellow, I believe, in the is it governance studies, or is it
political reform?
Political reform program. Yes. So Lee is a senior fellow in the political reform program, and has been doing various projects on democracy reform work for quite some time. And one of the so we're bringing him in here because he recently published a book called "Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop: The Case for Multi-Party Democracy in America." Actually, Ibrahim, if you can go ahead and put that link in there. So that's been a book that has prompted a lot of interesting discussions about the question of the two-party system. If you want a shorter distillation of some of the key arguments in that book, you might look at his piece in Foreign Policy magazine, "Let a Thousand Parties Bloom." I found the piece in the book fascinating, and I'm looking forward to Lee talking about it here today. Meantime, our other two guests co-wrote a book and have co-wrote some articles and essays together. Those guests are Stephen Teles and Robert Saldin. Steve Teles is a senior fellow at New America. At the Niskanen Center. Apologies. Is a senior fellow at the Niskanen Center, and is a professor of government at Johns Hopkins University. His writing partner for some of these recent projects is Robert Saldin, who is a professor of political science at the University of Montana, and is also a senior fellow at the Niskanen Center as well. So just to give some, and they wrote a book recently called "Never Trump: The Revolt of the Conservative Elites," one of the big themes of which is the question of the very different factions inside the Republican Party right now. And how in the aftermath of the 2016 election, and even before the 2016 election, there were concerted movements between different factions in the Republican Party to change up the way the Republican Party operated. And they wrote a piece based on some of the arguments of that book in the excellent magazine National Affairs sometime back. That piece is entitled "The Future is Faction." And that is both an excellent distillation of some of their work, but also just a fascinating and interesting piece on what American political parties look like too. So I mentioned all these, and as you can tell, Lee and Steve and Rob have been writing on some similar things, and they have some of the same analysis in some key ways, right? About the way that the American two-party system is sometimes too polarized and sometimes too calcified to really give representation to the multiple factions underneath them. But in a key sense, I think one of the key disagreements they have is that Lee believes we should go to institute reforms that can take us to a system where there are multiple political parties beyond just the two. And Steve and Rob believe that we can use the two-party system if only we were able to have parties, and there are reforms we can do for this, that were more factionalized and more fractious and diverse within themselves, which is not an insignificant difference. And so you are all joining us for what is, to my knowledge and to the best of their knowledge, the first event that they've been brought together to talk about this particular topic based on the arguments in their recent books. And so I'm just very proud that America's Public Forum is the host for this meeting, and I'm looking forward to learning some insights myself from this. So with that, we'll go ahead and get to the conversation. So Lee, Steve, and Rob, welcome to America's Public Forum. Thanks for joining us. And we'll go into the opening statements now. So Lee, would you like to introduce yourself? Take 5 to 8 minutes to introduce yourself and your argument, and then we'll move forward from there.
Sure. Hi, everybody. So, I think broadly, as you said, Luke, we kind of share a critique of current politics as two binary, two zero sum, and also take as our kind of jumping off point an earlier era of American politics that you could probably locate. I would call it from the mid '60s through the late '80s, in which there were genuine overlapping factions in our party system. And, it was a time in which American democracy, I think, worked reasonably well. There was a decent balance of separation of powers between Congress and the presidency. Congress was more functional, more committee based. There was a lot of landmark legislation that passed with large bipartisan support. Congress took policymaking seriously. Now, I think the question about how to get back to something like that, is the kind of core of our disagreement. I mean, we share what the kind of vision ought to be in broad strokes, but the how to get there, I think we differ. So, I think it's in kind of thinking about the points of disagreement. I think it's important to kind of understand what happened, which is to say, how did we get from then to now? And I think you can think about kind of three broad forces in American politics that really transformed our party system and our political landscape. One is the broad sorting of the political parties, which is sort of the slow realignment post civil rights as culture became the kind of central axis of political conflict, and that involved the transformation of the South. It involved the kind of basically what happened was that you had Southern conservatives within the Democratic Party, and liberal in the mostly from Northeast and some other places in the Republican Party, and those factions became basically extinct because it was harder and harder for those candidates to find a home in their parties as political conflict became more and more about cultural issues around racial identity issues, and there was the parties became much more homogenous on these questions, and the national image of the parties changed. And that takes me to the second point, which is the nationalization of politics. That in the past you had these very different local political parties and politicians who were much more connected to local issues. But what you've seen is actually a remarkable transformation in the extent to which people across the country, and even for very local offices, are really voting based on national issues. A kind of collapse of local media, an intense focus on control of Washington. And that has made it much harder for individual members of Congress to stand out as distinct from their parties. This is also has changed who enters politics and how the parties are organized. And they're much. I mean, they're still relatively weak by comparative standards. But they're stronger and more centralized than they've ever been in terms of messaging and consistency of messaging, and that has contributed to stakes polarization. The third aspect is really since the mid '90s we've been in this period in which control of Washington is constantly up for grabs. This unique period of very close national elections. And in these close elections, things become very competitive. And because they're competitive, the party who's basically the minority opposition party, doesn't want to make any compromise with the governing party. Instead, wants to demonize that party and wants to get back total power. Then push a very aggressive agenda, and that has contributed to a kind of further polarization and demonization of the other party, that there's no incentive for compromise because the parties are run in a somewhat disciplined way to prevent that. And you want to draw a sharp contrast that everything is about winning the next election. And all of this contributes to two very distinct party images. Two parties that have very different geographical bases and very different images in the public, tied up in a zero-sum battle, and that is increasingly a battle for the very definition of what our democracy is. I mean, now we're fundamentally entering a period in which the rules of our democracy are up for grabs. And this is a moment if we lose the shared sense of having free and fair elections, having a fair process, we are sliding into competitive authoritarianism. And some people might argue that we are already there. So I mean, to me, the key solution is to break this binary logic which is driving it, and allow moderates within both parties to kind of break from the more extremes and build a governing coalition from the center, rather than having this this pendulum back and forth, and which means a lot of gridlock and some moments of extreme policy lurches. And I think that the only way to do that is through electoral reforms, proportional representation that would make it possible for more parties to compete.
Can you talk a little bit real quick about what the dynamics of that might look like? Like what kinds of political parties are you expecting, like ideologically, would arise from there? And then how would they work together, and how would their working together be uniquely different from our current kind of bipolar logic, as you mentioned it there?
Yeah, so I mean, I think what you would likely see would be, on the left, you'd probably see, a more social democratic party, think Bernie Sanders, and a more kind of moderate, centrist Democratic Party. Think, Joe Biden, although he's now kind of trying to triangulate. So maybe think Amy Klobuchar or Pete Buttigieg in the last primary. And then the Republican Party, I think you'd see a splintering, that you'd have kind of a moderate reformist Republican Party. I sort of think like Ross Douthat or Reihan Salama, that kind of vision for the Republican Party. I think you'd see a more classically conservative Republican Party, although I think it seems like that's a party that would have an increasingly smaller role. And then, I think you would see a kind of ethno-nationalist party, but I think that ethno-nationalist party would be a lot smaller than it appears right now. And you would see what you see, throughout democracies in Western Europe, which is you'd see a governing coalition, and I think you'd see a much stronger Congress, because a highly polarized partisan Congress is not a very productive Congress, and one that leaves more to the executive branch. I think you'd see a different style of presidency, and maybe something even more like cabinet government, though a distinctly U.S. form. And I mean, look, it's you're still going to have fights. Politics is about conflict. I mean, the issues of politics are the issues that we can't agree on, so we have to bring to politics. But what you wouldn't have is a style in which you are trying to dominate the other side. I mean, there is a logic to our politics that is a fundamentally lesser of two evils logic, in which the goal is to demonize the other side. And that there's no lesser of three evils.
It sounds like
my children are now trying to interrupt me.
Oh, this is the best the best sort of way for these things to end. It sounds as well too like you were getting into getting towards the end of your spot. So we'll go ahead and go over to Rob and Steve's point now. But your children are welcome to stay with us for the duration of the event if they like. So no worries on that part. Perhaps they might be able to share some of their own insights as well on political party reform and the way we can go towards parliamentary governance on some of this. So, but Lee, thank you for that. There's so many questions coming up in my own head, and I'm sure in a lot of the audience's heads on this. So we will look forward to investigating some of those as we get further into here. So meantime, let's go over to Rob and Steve. Rob and Steve, if you'd like to, number one, introduce yourselves, and number two, introduce your argument and your proposed solutions and ideas on all this.
Yeah, thanks, Luke. I'll take the lead on this, and Steve can jump in and correct me as needed. But it's great to be here with you and Lee and Steve tonight for this event. And I guess I'd just start by saying, how much there is to like about what Lee has to say here and his work in general. And Steve and I, absolutely agree with Lee and his basic diagnosis of the problem. We agree that our kind of increasingly parliamentary style, winner-take-all, centrally planned political parties, that this really is a prime source of so much of what ails American politics. It's just that we're a little skeptical that Lee's preferred solution is realistic, given the realities of our political system. And moreover, I'd say that we think there's another path forward that's much more likely to be successful in creating the kind of pluralistic and entrepreneurial system that I think Lee and Steve and I would all like to see. So Steve and I basically think the path forward to try to revive what until recently was a common feature of American politics, and that is that we think the time is right for a return of organized and institutionalized factions within both the Democratic and the Republican parties, and we see this basically as a way of getting to, I think, kind of the same place that Lee wants to get to with his ideas for a multi-party system. But we see the factional route as being more natural and more in keeping with the American political tradition. And another one of the virtues of reviving these kind of strong intra-party factions that, again, used to be very common, is that it doesn't require the enormously difficult process of changing the Constitution or altering election rules in ways that are just inevitably going to be seen as very controversial, something that would have the effect of favoring one party over the other, which just makes it very, very difficult to institute something like that. So again, we agree entirely with Lee that there's certainly a demand out there in the American public for more than two options. And that's an entirely normal and natural thing, particularly in a big, diverse country like ours. In many other countries, of course, the way you deal with that demand is through a multi-party system. But in the United States, we have, of course, our two-party system. And, as Steve and I see it, that two-party system is pretty solidly baked into the cake. Because of single member districts, because of winner take all elections, it's just incredibly hard for third parties to gain a foothold in our system. And so, just one kind of rather obvious observation that nonetheless kind of helps us understand just how hard it is to start a new party is this. We haven't had a new party emerge in the United States in nearly 170 years. Right, that's when the GOP was formed from the ashes of the Whig Party. Right. Well, the fact that that's the last time we had a major party come onto the scene, that's just a very sobering fact for those of us who might look to that as as a way of solving some of our current problems. Now, on that kind of pessimistic note, Steve and I think do bring some good news here too, and that is that traditionally we see our two-party system as having actually been able to accommodate the demand for more than two options. And it's done that by having eclectic parties that have been home to these organized factions that we're talking about here. And again, it's worth emphasizing that this has been the norm over the course of American political history, right? And so just as an example, the Republican Party, it used to have a progressive faction and a stalwart faction. And then more recently, there was a moderate or even liberal faction that was associated with people like Nelson Rockefeller, that was based in the Northeast and on the West Coast. And then you also had this conservative faction that was based in the Sun Belt and the Midwest. Similarly, the Democratic Party was home to liberal Northerners and conservative Southern Democrats, right? And you can trace that back throughout American history. And that's, something like that kind of configuration of messy internal factionalized parties has been the norm. And these were organized groups that were institutionalized, and they competed with one another within each party. Now, to be sure, these factions were united in the sense that they had some shared interest in defeating the other party, which is essential for winning the White House and everything that flows from that. But they were also in competition with one another inside their own party, and they'd have to negotiate with one another over how to, for instance, organize the party caucus in Congress. And it was that kind of intra-party competition that helped to create much more play in the joints of the party system. And so, among other things, these intra-party factions decentralized, had the effect of decentralizing control from congressional leadership, and facilitated and opened up the possibility for collaborations across party lines. So while recent decades, we've seen increasingly homogenous parties, and Lee spoke to some of the reasons for that, and increasingly polarized parties. It seems to me that this is a moment in which we could see a return to that kind of factionalized politics. And in fact, I think we can already see some of this kind of thing already emerging, particularly on the Democratic side, and maybe later in the program we'll have a chance to kind of spin out how we see those factions emerging. But I guess one other thing I want to note just here at the outset, Steve and I are always careful to say that we aren't necessarily predicting this. We see a return to factionalized party politics as one plausible scenario, but there are obviously other scenarios as well. So the opportunity is there, but it isn't going to happen all by itself, right? There's no iron law of social science that makes this inevitable. It's going to matter what people do, the choices they make. It's going to matter where philanthropists choose to devote their resources. And, we also recognize that it's, I think, very easy to kind of be seduced by a lot of this kind of do-gooder democracy reform, rule changing kind of thing. And the never-Trumpers who we spent the last several years studying and writing a book about, one of our critiques of them actually is that they've leaned more into that kind of thing rather than actually fighting for the soul of their party. But we also think that whole mentality, it can devolve into kind of a search for quick fixes that kind of promise to solve all of our problems, quickly and neatly. And too often we think reformers are just overly focused on changing the rules rather than doing the hard work, the protracted work, but the absolutely essential work of actually organizing people and nurturing institutions. And so in the long run, Steve and I contend that there's no real substitute for that kind of hard work. And we would like to see more partisan actors, both in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, engage in that kind of work. And again, we're seeing some of the what we hope are the beginnings of that, but we'd like to see more.
Well, I'd love to hear at some length maybe off the record if necessary, who in particular you see the modern mugwumps, so to speak, as being. But we don't have to have it on the record if it would be best or not. So before we get to the kind of cross-examination part of this, I want to, number one, open the floor to Steve to say anything else on this front. And also, I'm curious on Steve and Rob, your thesis here. Rob, you mentioned a little bit about how this would work practically in terms of coalitions and factions forming. But Steve, when you're talking, could you talk a little bit as well about how that would be different from having multiple parties setting up temporary coalitions as well?
Yeah, so I think the thing I would emphasize, and it is really important before we go hammer and tong, that Lee and us really do have more in common than we disagree about, right? That there's a segment of political reformers out there who think the basic thing we need to do is allow majorities of the existing parties to govern in more centralized ways with fewer institutional impediments. That is just to sort of, give the American people, quote, what they want and give it to them good and hard. And then if the public doesn't like it, then they can turn out. So there is a kind of Westminster parliamentary idea behind that. You see that in people like Ezra Klein. And I think, maybe Lee and I we haven't talked about this for a while, so maybe we disagree on this, but I think there's a suspicion on both of our parts that the United States is just too heterogeneous for that kind of extremely strong, centralized kind of party system to operate. We just have too much heterogeneity for that to really legitimate itself with a tolerable level of social disorder. So that's the first thing I'd say. The second thing I'd say, so now we have to get in the fight because that's kind of the point of these things, is I do think there's a very significant danger for political formers to be tempted by the siren song of Lee and people who are less intelligent than Lee, which is all the rest of the people on his side of this, that there really is a certain zero-sum quality to what people can do with their time, right? For people who think that there's a significant problem with our political system, you can either devote your time toward institutional changes that you think are going to get you closer to the ability to have a third party, right? Or you could invest that energy and mobilization time into actually fighting out inside the existing parties, right? And I think by drawing some of that attention, some of that mobilizing effort outside of the party system, drawing that money, those resources, all those things that could go into building these internal party factions, right? That would force their leadership to have to negotiate, force their leadership to allow for cross-party coalitions. That's the only way that we can see within something like, a causal story that sounds even remotely plausible, that you're going to get the play in the joints that both we and Lee want. And I think that's part of the notion, is that in that sense, we don't think Lee's argument is simply incorrect around the margins, right? It's dangerous because it directs organizing and other kinds of activity away from what would actually be likely to get us to an outcome that we would, I think all three of us would like more. And so in that sense, it's not simply a costless kind of exercise. We actually think that there's a significant cost to driving people toward hopes for those sort of institutional fixes.
Well, thank you, Steve and Rob. Lee, now you have the time to respond on this, and I'm actually quite interested to see where you think the flaws are, and I know you have some interesting thoughts on this, on Steve and Rob's ideas about a factionalized two-party system as well. So Lee, floor is yours. You're on mute, Lee.
All right. Well, okay. Well, thank you for those comments. And yes, Steve, absolutely. I agree that the Westminster style of responsible parties who just, govern and then show the people what they do is an ideal that, has really never made any sense for American democracy, certainly not now. Although it's certainly long been appealing to a lot of folks in political science. I'm not sure how it's working so well for the British right now either. But I think there are fundamental flaws with it. So we'll put that aside. We agree there. So is pursuing institutional reform a dangerous waste of money? Obviously, I don't believe so. I think, Rob is right that within the single winner first past the post system, third parties are doomed. But you've already seen growing interest in ranked choice voting in Maine and Alaska now, which is as well as many cities, which is kind of one step towards opening up reform. There's legislation in Congress, the Fair Representation Act, which would create multi-member districts with ranked choice voting. So there's a little momentum there. Obviously, there could be more. I see growing interest in that, and it's true that electoral reform is hard, but it's not impossible. And we've had periods in the United States in which we've fundamentally rewritten the rules of our democracy. And I think about the progressive era in which we passed direct election of senators and the introduction of the primary and the initiative and referendum process in half of the states, and as well as women's suffrage. And at the beginning of that era, you'd say, how would elected politicians do any of that undermines their own power? But there is a story of electoral reform in many Western democracies, including most recently New Zealand, in which there's a deep level of public frustration, and politicians realize that they would do just as well, if not even better, under an alternate set of rules, and those changes are possible. I don't see this as a zero-sum fight for resources. I think there's value in investing in party factions, but I think there's a challenge, which is to say, Rob wrote a very interesting essay that I highly commend for Niskanen, thinking about how Democrats could win more elections in states like Montana, where he's from, in the Dakotas, maybe even Idaho, with a kind of Democrats. It was not that long ago when Democrats, did reasonably well in those elections, and there's. But we look at the recent, we look at the recent election, the Senate election in Montana, in which Democrats had an extremely strong candidate in Steve Bullock, who's still lost pretty solidly. I guess, John Tester is still a Democratic senator from Montana, but he's, I think somewhat endangered. I think that the challenge is that so much of our politics has become so fundamentally nationalized that it's really hard to get voters in this current period to look past the D or the R and to think about the candidate themselves. For governor, that's one thing, and that's a separate piece. But for senator, for a member of Congress, so much is about control of Washington. And it's not that people are not voting on issues. People are voting on identity. And we've seen over the last 2 decades, but really over the last decades, a remarkable transformation in the way in which urban and rural America have just split very much in terms of where they are culturally. And for a lot of folks in the sort of white rural small town America, they really have been told that their way of life is under threat. And it's very hard to see a path by which the Democratic Party reclaims that in this moment of high intensity national culture war politics that is so oriented around this binary us versus them. And I think it's certainly worth trying. Maybe an even more efficient way of money would be to bus a bunch of hipsters from Brooklyn into Missoula and turn Missoula into the new Brooklyn. Boise into the new San Francisco. But so but I think that the way challenge is then how do you get quality candidates to wanna run in these places, and how do you get the party, which has limited resources, to invest in those candidates in those races when they're trying to win all the swing races? And I think, to be honest, I think both of our solutions are up against a steep incline, but I think there are a number of reasons that if we were to say, okay, both of these things being equally unlikely, what are the other benefits of these different approaches? So I think one advantage of a proportional system is that it institutionalizes this diversity. It creates a kind of it's a multipartism for the long haul. Another advantage is it makes gerrymandering, renders gerrymandering marginal. And if you have multi-member districts, it means that every vote counts equally because every vote is equally important. It means voters are going to participate at a much higher rate because there's going to be much more competitive elections. There's going to be more parties engaging voters. What we see in multi-party democracies is just higher level of engagement. Proportional multi-party democracies, higher levels of trust in government because you have broader governing coalitions that more people feel engaged in, and more parties that are more about policy and less about demonization. So I think there are a ton of other benefits from a proportional multi-party system that are not just about solving polarization. And I think it is a big ask, but we've done some pretty remarkable transformations in the history of American democracy, and I really do feel that we are entering another era of democracy transformation. And there's just a ton of energy around democracy reform, and there's a movement building.
So I just want to take this point of chair's privilege to mention that if we do wind up turning Missoula into the new Brooklyn, it would make some just sense to turn, I don't know, Georgetown into the new Spotsylvania County or something along those lines, just for red blue balance. But that's a long-term urban planning project, which will have a political process behind itself as well. So we shall see. Steve, you have a response.
Yeah. So one, I think Republicans certainly should be able to do that with Staten Island. I think it would only take a few people from Montana to get Staten Island over the hump. So a couple of points. One is I think Lee is actually wrong that these are both equally unlikely. So go with my fantastic dream argument. I don't think they're equally likely. And I think in a way, one problem is Lee's alternative, which I'm sympathetic to the idea that if I could click my heels and get there, I might go there, right? That's, I haven't thought it all the way down the game tree, but I'm pretty close on that. But his is really either an A or B, right? You either get there and then you got a pretty different system, right? Or you try and get there and you fail, and then you've gotten more or less nothing, right? Whereas the advantage of driving some of that, what he calls sort of democracy reform energy into party faction building, right, is every little bit of it actually gets you something, right? There's no waste in any little bit of energy that you've got trying to actually build up a faction that even a few members of Congress, as I think we're going to be seeing from Joe Manchin, right? Even a few members of Congress who are off of their party median can actually lead to a fairly different way of governing, right? And more than one, right? 2 or 3 or 4 can often have a very significant effect. So that's the first thing I'll say is there's, if you think about what people who care about democracy should do at the margin, should they put their energy into institutional reform or should they put their energy into mobilizing inside of the parties? The argument for doing the latter is every little ounce of that you do actually gets you something on the way, whereas Lee's is either a win or go home. The second thing I'll say is Lee mentioned the nationalization of parties, and I think he said that in a way to sort of suggest that, you know, more factional diversity was impossible. Now, I think, you know, that when you think about a lot of the heterogeneity we had in the past, a lot of that was because of very peculiar idiosyncratic regional or state brands, right? People had, you know, in that sense, you know, being a, you know, a North Carolina Democrat, right, meant something, right? That people in North Carolina thought that that actually really told them something distinct, right? Or a Montana Republican, you know, Democrat or Republican, all those sort of state-specific things. And I think Lee is right that the nationalization of politics, especially the media, has increasingly erased those state-specific local brands that people could use to differentiate themselves. Now, I think that's an argument for factionalism, right? That is, the one difference about a faction is a faction can be a national brand. It's a national sub-brand of the national party brand, right? And so I think increasingly, if people want to effectively differentiate themselves in places like Montana or other places like that, they're going to have to do it by affiliating with national factional brands that are playing out the national media that people recognize across different geographic spaces. And so in a way, we're in the middle between two different sources of heterogeneity, a period in which some of that heterogeneity came from local brands, right? And we haven't really gotten to the period of having well-developed, well-funded, organized national brands that people in places like Montana can actually identify with and know that they're actually voting for something different than that part of the party that they think they don't like.
It's interesting as I hear this this discourse coming going back and forth. I'm reminded a little bit of one of the major divisions in American politics at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries. And in some ways, Lee's arguments are kind of the spiritual descendants of some of those argued by the progressives, right? Like Theodore Roosevelt, the great reformer kind of generation. And a lot of the things that Rob and Steve have been saying are things along the lines of the old political, some people call them realists, their enemies call them hacks, but like the kinds of party machine kind of types who like lived and breathed as a factional interest group kind of thing. Notably like George Washington Plunkett and a couple other thinkers there. So it's just interesting to me as a student of history myself watching this, because it is certainly true that there have been excesses in both kind of party institutionalism and in government's reformism, but it can't be denied as well that they both of these kinds of ways of thought have been hugely influential in different ways in shaping the American government and political system, even despite the fact that neither of them fully took over it, you know. And I'm just excited listening to this to see like the ways that some of the reform ideas that that Lee's talking about, but also some of the party institution changes that Steve and Rob are talking about is there. So I hope none of you are too offended by my historical comparisons there, by the way.
Not at all. And I mean, I do want to respond to. I mean, I think Steve's cast this a little bit as an either or approach, and you know, I mean, frankly, I think that we can do both, and there's there's a lot of money, an increasing amount of money going into democracy reform right now, an increasing amount of energy, and frankly, I think if factions in both parties were successful in emerging, that there would be a lot more votes for electoral reform that would allow the parties to actually the factions actually to form distinct parties. And so, I don't see, I don't see us fighting over fixed resources. But I think we can join forces and work together.
Well, this opens up some potential nonprofit strategy and foundation world fiscal problems as well, which is a totally different world too in this front, but fascinating one nonetheless. I just want to let everybody in the audience know that we're going to transition to our Q&A session in about 5 minutes from now. So if you have questions that have come up from any of this conversation, or if you want to bring up something that hasn't been brought up and ask the speakers about it, feel free to start getting your questions ready and getting your Zoom hands prepared in a few minutes here. But meantime, I just want to go close to a last question of the three speakers real quick. So we've talked about the different visions, right, of multi-party democracy and factional two-party democracy. We've talked about the problems in both of them and some of the promises and prospects and some of the reforms on both of them. But we haven't talked a lot yet about what it would specifically look like, right? Some things about which different ideologies would show up, some things about what kinds of like the state and local versus the national kind of stuff will come up. But I don't know, it's an interesting kind of thing. So Rob, I was wondering if you could tell us, because you had brought this up in your initial talk, if we were to go to something along these lines, factional, and presumably, and Lee, we'll ask you about this too, if we were to go to something like this in a multi-party situation, what would this look like in terms of the different sorts of groups that came up? Could you talk about that?
Yeah, sure, Luke, and maybe just to go back to the previous discussion just briefly, I do sometimes think it's helpful to have an example to kind of help illustrate some of the things that Steve was talking about. I mean, one thing you can kind of think about, and that one of the things we kind of have in mind is something like what happened with the Democratic Party after the huge landslide defeats that they suffered in the 80s at the presidential level, right? Mondale in 84, Dukakis in 88. And one of the things that emerged out of that was this thing called the Democratic Leadership Council, which was associated with Bill Clinton. And that was the kind of institutionalized faction that we're talking about here. Right, it went by other names too, is sometimes called the New Democrats and whatnot. But it had its own think tank, it had its own magazines, it had its whole host of policy wonk types that were affiliated with it. It cultivated a whole network of elected officials, and the key thing was that Democrats like Bill Clinton and others were able to go out and say, hey, I'm not a Ted Kennedy Democrat, I'm a DLC Democrat. And enough people knew what that meant. It was something that differentiated them from the other people in the party. And so that's the kind of thing we have in mind. But Luke, on your question here, you know, what might those look like now? We see three kind of rather obvious, I think, ways in which the Democratic Party could break into these factions. And again, we're already seeing a little bit of it. And two on the Republican side. But so on the Democratic side, you've got, I think, the DSA wing, Democratic-Socialist of America, and that already is kind of coming into place. And you can kind of see that getting institutionalized. And incidentally, you know, the way Steve and I think about this is not at all unlike the way Lee sees these things breaking down in terms of different parties. But so you have that DSA wing with Bernie Sanders and AOC and the Squad and those types. Then you've got the Democratic establishment, and maybe two different kind of key elements of that. One you could think of as kind of the Biden piece, and then the Clyburn piece, and African Americans, right, as kind of being the real pillars of the Democratic establishment. And then there's another faction that we could see emerging that we call the market liberal faction, and these are basically types who are suspicious of regulation, don't like unions, but are socially very liberal. So you know, think Silicon Valley types for that. On the Republican side, obviously all the energy right now is with the kind of Trumpy populist types, and obviously, I mean, we see that being clearly the majority faction. But we think there is space on the Republican side for another faction, which we call liberal conservative. And that's slightly confusing, I gather, but still, we kind of have in mind a kind of liberal in the sense of liberal democracy. And so this more liberal conservative faction you could think of as being embodied by someone like Charlie Baker, the Massachusetts governor, or Larry Hogan, the governor of Maryland. And so, I mean, you see these models, they're out there, right? But right now, all it is are these people as individuals. What is lacking is something kind of connecting the Larry Hogans and the Charlie Bakers and the Adam Kinzingers. Although Adam Kinzinger is doing some work to try to carve out, I think, something like a faction along the lines of what we're talking about. We'll see how successful he is. But that's basically the way we see it playing out, Luke.
Well, it's interesting. Somebody told me a while ago that it would be fascinating to see a party politics, whether within two parties or in 4 or 5 or 8 parties, where Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez could work with Nancy Pelosi on one thing, and then Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez could work with Josh Hawley on another thing, and Josh Hawley could work on one thing with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, but then he could go and work with Mitt Romney on something else, and Mitt Romney could go work with Nancy Pelosi on one thing and with Josh Hawley on another thing, so on and so forth. And I guess, and Lee, let me pitch this question back to you as the last thing before we go into Q&A. So you've said that the system, if it were to develop along the lines that you've said, would probably wind up being something like a 5-party system, ideally. I believe. Correct me if I'm remembering your piece wrong on that. But so if we were to get into that, and there were to be such kinds of shifting coalitions at the national level, bleeding down onto the local levels, how do you think that would affect some of well, number one, why do you think that's ideal, and then number two, how do you think that would emerge over the years as a new situation outside the 2-party gridlock system?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's a good number. Generally, 5 to 6 seems to be a kind of ideal number, that it offers enough choices, but not an overwhelming number of choices. When you wind up with too many parties, it becomes harder to form coalitions. It becomes more confusing for voters. So certainly, something like a modest multi-party system, with not super large districts or modest thresholds, you can keep it at about 5 or 6. I mean, it would just fundamentally change the dynamics of governing, but it would be somewhat akin to what you described, is that you could have different coalitions working together on different issues, and the value is that it allows the parties, right now, when you talk about factions, and it's important to understand what the criticism, when there's a sort of idealized version of responsible parties that the political science reformers were talking about in the 1950 Apps report, for example, and their criticism of the factionalized parties was that it was hard for voters to know what the parties really were, because they were sort of these jumbles of factions, so the idea of having the parties competing against each other in the same space without without the spoiler effect of third parties, right? So that voters in a state or in a district could choose between the social democrats and the establishment Democrats, and the reform liberal conservatives and the ethno-nationalist conservatives. But if the factions exist within the party, then they're constantly competing in primaries, or maybe, the advantage of the multi-party is it makes it clear to the voters what the actual parties are and what the choices are, rather than these factions kind of being hidden within the party. I mean, to the extent that it's even possible. And I mean, the big difference, and Rob talks about the example of the DLC and Clinton, kind of emerging in the Democratic Party in 1992. I think it's important to understand that at that period, Democratic Party had a strong Southern conservative tradition, so you didn't have to invent that whole cloth. Democratic Party, yeah, I mean, the liberals had been ascendant, but there was still a strong conservative tradition in which a governor from Arkansas, which, the culturally conservative state, could be an important player. Now the Democrats are out of business in Arkansas, as well as throughout most of the South. And there's, even the most, even the moderate Democrats are not that close to the Republicans on a lot of issues. So the parties, they're, and this is the same problem with the Never Trump faction, which is that they just got creamed, because they were tiny, and they were kind of out of touch with where the Republican electorate was. So the parties are very different now than they were 20, 30 years ago. So there's not that same opportunity for these kind of interesting overlapping factions, and the brands are much more nationalized, and partisan identities are much deeper. So, I think we have to hit much harder at the structure of our entire party system, so.
No, it's well, and that itself is one of the most crucial points here too. So thank you for that explanation, and I look forward to number one, engaging with you over time moving forward as we figure out how the parties evolve post 2020. But number two, I'm also looking forward to hearing everybody's questions for our esteemed panelists here as well. So we'll move into the Q&A moment here real quick. I just want to make a quick note. Lee mentioned a report that came out in the 1950s by the American Political Science Association, where a majority of American political scientists, including some people who are still read today, argued that our politics was not polarized enough, where the argument was that voters didn't have a real choice, right? Now here we are 70 years after that, and we are in an opposite kind of problem. And we have political scientists in this room with us discussing different ways to do that, right? And I think that just kind of does testimony to the fact that a lot of the things that we run into are very historically constructed, right? There are ways in which they have universal and eternal tendencies, but in some sense, we live as products of our times. And I guess like at some level, just watching all this, getting insights from Steve and Rob and Lee, and thinking in history, it humbles me a little bit, I guess, in just the sense that like, wow, it's we're not living in the 1890s, we're not living in the 1960s, we're living in the 2020s, and we can learn things from those, but there's more there too. If you want a good take on that report, by the way, a guy named Sam Rosenfeld, who I believe some of our speakers have engaged with in the past, wrote a book called The Polarizers, Post-War Architects of Our Partisan Era, that starts off with anecdotes about that particular report, and it's definitely a worthwhile read. So, all right, so all this being said, let's go into Q&A. We will go and try to get as many folks in as we can. We will probably take the last question right about 9:50. So I will do my best to get through everybody. I would ask that you keep your question to about 1 minute or so. If you want to frame things, feel free, but try to keep it in 1 minute, and try please to keep it in the form of a question. And I think our speaker, and also if it's directed towards one speaker or if it's directed generally towards all the speakers, feel free to include that as well. So we will go first to Rita Chisholm. Rita, welcome. Please unmute yourself. You have a minute to ask a question.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the speakers being here. As probably one of the only kindergartners in the room that has more life behind me than I do in front of me, I'm very interested in, the time frame, well, I say time frame, what kind of a change, this type of change, I know it's done gradually, but in reality, is there a time that you can set that, would I see some of these changes, or how long do they take for something this major to happen? Thank you.
That's an excellent question. Who wants to take it?
I mean, I'll do quickly. I mean, again, I think this is a little bit what the nature of the disagreement that Lee and I were having earlier, right? Which is, there's already a lot of possibility to build up coherent factions in various states. So, Liam Kerr is here. I'm calling out Liam. He's in Massachusetts, right? To some degree, Liam's already trying to do this work up there, right? One of our arguments is the people who are trying to do this kind of faction building work need ammo, right? Compared, when Lee was saying, well, there's lots of money in the democracy reform space. Well, there's a lot of money in the democracy reform space for having people reform institutions. There's not a lot of money in the democracy reform space for people actually out there doing democracy. That is the democracy that occurs inside of parties and trying to build up these alternative factions. So I actually think the time horizon on doing that, in particular, especially important pivotal states, is not really that long, right? Everything that's really important in politics does involve investment, right? It involves doing things now in the hopes that that's going to, give you a probability of change in the future. And in some sense, one of the greatest dangers for really significant political change is excessive urgency, right? A belief that you need to have things happen this year, right? I'm, to the degree in which I'm an expert on anything, it's on the conservative movement in the United States, right? And that a lot of the victories they had were things that were only like 10, 15, 20 years after they did the original investment did they actually get the return. And so, partially, right, politics is a little bit of a relay race, right, where you may not get all the way there, Rita, right, but you hopefully if you pass something on to somebody else and you get things moving in the right direction, that you can actually get a lot of change. And I think that's again the case in this question of building up especially moderate factions inside the two parties.
Thank you. Rita, that really makes it, that helps to clear that question up for me. Thank you.
Well, Rita, for what it's worth, we do have you here with us now in Braver Angels, and we very much appreciate you being here.
Yeah. I'm so thankful for Braver Angels. Thank you.
Lee, did you want to talk anything about the time question as well?
I think a lot about the Hemingway quote about how we went broke slowly and then all at once, which is to say that change is nonlinear. There are moments of stuckness, and then change happens very fast, and that is kind of the history of politics, of society, is lots of long periods in which nothing much seems to happen, and then quick periods in which change happens very quickly. And so short answer is I don't know. I think it feels like we're entering a moment in which we're on the verge of some potential big changes. Things could go in a lot of different directions, including I fear some very ugly directions, some very violent directions. But I think there's also a moment, a window, in which we can rethink some very fundamental concepts of how we do democracy in this country. And it's something that doesn't come around very often, and it seems to come around in roughly 60-year cycles: the Revolutionary War, Jacksonian democracy, the Progressive Era, Civil Rights Era, and we're due for another one of these. So maybe things will happen fast.
Well, I think that can't be denied, and so I appreciate you bringing that up as well. Let's go over to Liam Kerr. Liam, would you like to unmute yourself? And since Steve partially introduced you, you can introduce yourself as well too.
I'll try to keep it to 60 seconds, but yeah, at the state level, trying to do kind of a market liberal ish network here in Massachusetts. And then at the national level, also part of an effort called the Welcome Party. We actually had a Clyburn related event today with the South Carolina Democratic Party on having a big tent that a bunch of these factions can fit within on the left. But a fan of Lee's structure, even though I'm more of a Teles acolyte and acting on that. And so actually from Lee's Twitter feed found this event and really fascinated by the Braver Angels concept in work. So actually for Lee, I think a really interesting thing I'd love to hear more about is the concept of risk. I think when Stephen mentioned kind of dangerous, and I think that's an interesting word and concept. And thinking about the opportunity cost, it does seem like a little bit of how bad is it right now? What is the downside risk of the moment we're in? And there's almost a net present value time situation there. So I think kind of a touch on that would be interesting. I think the chances of it happening also, just even in the ballpark, I think, in that philanthropic world, is it a 10% chance, a 20% chance of all the co-innovation that has to happen at the same time? I live in Massachusetts, as Steve mentioned, where the ballot initiative for ranked choice voting was 10 million to 10,000 and lost. And so I'll pause there, but those are my two questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Liam. Steve?
So just on ranked choice voting, it's funny, I feel so unbelievably conflicted on ranked choice voting. And I think anyone who doesn't feel conflicted on ranked choice voting really ought to get them to a space of conflictedness. So part of I think the issue with ranked choice voting is partially, again, I think it's not as potent as people think it is. That I think there's a lot of people who think that this is like the skeleton key to cracking polarization, and I'm not convinced. One part of this, and this goes back to a point that I was making earlier, which is, ultimately, I think democracy is government by the people who show up. Right. That's in some sense the defect of democracy is that it's highly sensitive to preference intensity. It's highly sensitive to the people who really, really care about it. Right. And one of the problems with, especially with moderates, right, is we generally don't care as much, right? We're not, people who wake up in the morning thinking the government's trying to put, a chip in our brain. If I really believe the government was trying to put a chip in my brain, I would be doing nothing all day but trying to, stop it and find other people who also believe that government was trying to put a chip in my brain, right?
Yeah, that's the chip in your brain doing the talking.
Yeah, there you go. But normies don't think that way, right? Normies, right, which again is one way I think of people who are moderates, right? They think of politics as one part of life. They think it, in some cases, shouldn't be, it shouldn't take over everything about how we think, right? But one defect of that is it makes it harder to mobilize people like that, right? And so part of my guess is any electoral system you have is still going to be highly sensitive to preference intensity. You can change the rules around, and those intense believers will find some way to work whatever system you have, right? Now, again, if you had ranked choice voting in a context in which you had more organized factions, right, then it's a little easier for me to imagine that they would be able to exploit ranked choice voting to get them more, to make them more effectual than they would be otherwise, right? So it's not, it isn't impossible for me to imagine that ranked choice voting could, and sort of attempts to create more party factionalization might be like two great tastes that taste great together. But I worry that if you do ranked choice voting, but without factional organization, you may not actually get much or anything. And so that again is why, again, when I think about what it is that people should be doing with their spare time, with their marginal hour, right? It's more that they ought to be actually practicing democracy and going out there and fighting for their side inside of the existing structure we have, rather than devoting their energy to trying to change that structure for what may in fact be somewhat unpredictable effects. But I have to admit, I'm not as hostile as I used to be. So that's not like a great support, but less hostile than I used to be is in fact a change in position.
It's high praise coming from you. But I mean, it is an important point. And, I mean, I also think ranked choice voting has been oversold, even as I've been an overseller of it sometimes myself. And I think, particularly single winner ranked choice voting. But I mean, to your point, Maine has ranked choice voting, and there hasn't been a huge increase in third party support. I mean, there's been more third party activity than there was prior. But I mean, you're right. You need to also build those factions, and there's a little bit of a chicken or egg problem here, which is that on the one hand, without ranked choice voting, it's a lot harder for those factions to compete independently. Unless they're going to fight in primaries, which is hard to do for the moderate factions. But of course, even with ranked choice voting, you still actually do need to do the hard work of building those factions. But I mean, I do want to pick up on a point about moderates, and I mean, I think there is a question of just how many genuine moderates there really are out there, and this is certainly a debate within political science. I think what you see, I mean, and as I think we would agree on this, Steve, that a lot of folks who are moderates are really cross-pressured voters who are liberal on one dimension, conservative on the other dimension, and so I don't know if we should consider them moderates or just people who are kind of left out of the party system, and can have quite extreme preferences on certain issues or just sort of be incoherent, and whether they form a faction or whether they're just kind of out there waiting for some leader to come along, is I think an important question.
Yeah, can I just say one thing just really quickly on that, which is so I agree. So I sometimes use, and Rob and I sometimes use moderate as a shorthand, but I think it's actually not a very good term. And when we actually wrote Futurist Faction, I remember the stage where Rob and I were going and like scrubbing as many references to moderate as we could out of the piece, because I actually do think, especially in the Republican Party, that the two factions we imagine are probably not best understood as like conservative and moderate, right? They're arguably two species of what you might consider to be conservative, right? That is, so again, when Lee was talking about cross-pressured voters, right? Populists are cross-pressured voters, right? One short definition of populist is, there are people who've got fairly nationalistic or ethnocentric sort of preferences on cultural issues, and they're much more open. They're much, they're less cosmopolitan and also less generally sympathetic to markets, right? Or their economic positions are often derivative of their positions on culture, right? There's another way to put it, right? The other faction in the Republican Party is arguably also quite conservative, right? But they're conservative. They're a little bit like the old Coke conservatism, right? So in some ways, right, they've got a cross-pressured and a non-cross-pressured set of voters, right? So there's some work by Chris Parker that came out in September 2019 that, where he was sort of trying to get at some of these internal factions in the Republican Party, and he finds that there really are two quite different behavioral groupings in the Republican Party, right? It isn't that what he calls sort of the never Trump group are just like minuscule. They're actually quite large, right? And it's important to remember that Donald Trump's support in the Republican Party, in the sense of the people who actually voted for him in a competitive primary, was barely 50%, right? There were a lot of people who preferred something else, right? And that's where I think the idea that the Republican Party had simply entirely capitulated was always somewhat overstated, because it was always when the choice was Donald Trump or a Democrat, as opposed to Donald Trump versus some other Republican. And I think there's lots of behavioral evidence that there is in fact a market for this other kind of faction in the Republican Party.
I will say about every 8 months, one of my fellow conservative intellectual young journalists writes a new typology of the different kinds of Republicans, right? And it's usually anywhere between 3 and 7 and sometimes like 10 or 12 groups. And it's interesting because there's trends that change in it. And most of the time they never say moderate. But there are a bunch of different kinds of factional groups that might be considered moderate, but they give them a thing. So I think it's an important point there too. So let's go for next question to Marta Nieves. Marta, would you like to unmute yourself? You have 1 minute. You're still on mute.
There it is.
There you
Okay, I'm fairly new to Braver Angels. And as I've been listening, I would love to have some of those resources that many of you mentioned, books you have written and that sort of thing. If we could have a list, that would be fabulous. Luke, do you go by Luke or Nathan? Luke,
Luke, I go by Luke.
okay, Luke. Yeah, that would be helpful. But as I've been listening, I miss certain words that in my vocabulary and in the local party that I'm involved in, you hear more of, and that's collaboration, working things out for the good of the people, you know, so, and I hear a lot of what I call labels being used as definitions. And I think definitions make a lot more sense, because people will say, well, are you a conservative or are you a liberal or are you what? I'm a company of one. And I see agreement in a lot of different areas. And I think also the society, and I want to ask those of you who are the speakers, changes that you have seen in the society that makes it very difficult to implement anything that you can really grab a hold of, because change is so constant. And we're dealing with global issues at the same time we're dealing with local issues. And, you know, I've lived in a lot of places.
So Marta, is your
20 years. I'm running just one more thing. And I've lived in other countries. And we're in a whole different situation now. I am 84 years old. I've been through a lot of stuff in different groups. So I would love to hear from those of you who are political scientists on what you're seeing now that seems very different from what things were like 20, 30 years ago.
Thank you, Marta. Excellent question. And by the way, for what it's worth, you do not look like you're 84 years old.
I know. And I'm still running strong.
Keep it up. Keep it up. So thank you, Marta, for the question. Lee, Steve, Rob, what's different now from how it was 20 or 30 years from now?
Well, I mean, I think we've covered quite a bit of that in this conversation. You know, America, the parties are much more clearly sorted. Politics is much more nationalized and fought over two conflicting visions of national identity. You know, I think the parties have, I think really the last 20 years have brought a really sharp transformation. I mean, I was looking at polling from 20 years ago, and barely half of Americans said it made that much of a difference which party ran the government, and now overwhelmingly people see a clear difference in which party runs the government.
Yeah, I mean, I could say just a little bit about this. I do think, I mean, one thing that Marta said, which is that, she's thinks of herself as an individual, right? She judges things on the merits and people on the merits. And on one level, that's a very admirable quality. But I do think the bias, and this is something I think Lee and I probably don't disagree on, is politics is a team sport, right? Yeah. And it requires a certain flattening of identity, right? That is people like your kids or your friends or whatever will like know you in the whole. They'll know you in the round with all your idiosyncrasies, right?
Right.
It's not possible for politics to incorporate that level of idiosyncrasy, right? Although I do think it's important for organizations that are doing politics to actually be sufficiently face-to-face, that they actually can, create bonds between people who actually know each other in that more human level. But it's simply a crude fact that, especially the fact that we have a political system for a continental republic, right? We are not a small agora, right? We are a ginormous country, and you need big aggregates to somehow organize all of that difference. And so one thing I'll say is, this is, again, I think often an unfortunate quality of people. And again, I share a lot of the idiosyncrasies I think that Marta has too. But the people like us often then think, oh, well, I'm so much smarter than these simplifications that everybody's using, right? Or they all seem dumb or over, but I think part of it is we all have to make kind of crude choices in politics and try and move those crude choices as close to the complexity that we know exists as possible. And that's where I think, joining our existing imperfect, crude parties and trying to create space for people with a little more nuance, I think is the right way to go.
Well, and for what it's worth, everybody here, and Marta, and everybody here, this is one of the reasons why I'm a big fan of some of the things we do in Braver Angels, is because in the sense of not necessarily trying to get any specific policy things done, we have some of these conversations ourselves, including this one that's happening here. So thank you for that, Steve. I think that's very helpful framing on that front. So let's go. I'm sorry, Marta, we can't take follow-ups on this. Just
I know we need to go on, but I just wanted to say, Steve, you should not make assumptions. I'm very active in the party.
Thank you, Marta.
I belong to.
Marta, thank you for your comments. So let's go real quick to Wayne Ode. We have 20 minutes left of Q&A, and I will try to get through as many people as we can. So Wayne, unmute yourself. You have 1 minute to ask.
I'd like to know where truth and facts are in this discussion. And my question would be, can't we force politicians to tell the truth and respect facts?
Thank you, Wayne. Lee, Steve, Rob, any of you want to take that?
I'm not sure what the question is specifically. Maybe is it a question of have we lost a sense of truth and facts in politics? And if so, I think there is a sense in which we've entered in a world in which there's a kind of bifurcation of epistemologies, and that is a very dangerous thing for our democracy.
Rob, do you have any thoughts on this?
I feel like I missed part of the question, but I gathered it was about where does truth fit in?
Truth, facts, shared epistemology, some things about expertise on there, and that kind of front. Where does that fit amid the questions of party factions and different ways of viewing the policy world?
Well, I guess I'd just make the brief observation that as Lee suggested too, I think that's something very much to be concerned about. I mean, obviously, I think as Lee envisions a multi-party system, and Steve and I envision a return to factionalized parties, that we kind of proceed with those assumptions. The idea that people are going to have a shared commitment to at least some basic facts. and that truth will matter. So I'm not sure the degree to which that really pertains to our discussion here. In a way, I think that's a bigger, more fundamental, in many ways more concerning dynamic than that kind of overshadows the entire political system. And I'm not sure the degree to which it enters into thinking through what the future of our political party system should be, multi-party or stick with the two-party system and try to create more space for entrepreneurial activity through factions and whatnot. I mean, that's really kind of a bigger question that goes to the heart of liberal democracy.
Well, and Wayne and everybody who's interested in this, we may well be doing an America's Public Forum event on the role of knowledge, expertise, and public epistemology sometime in the coming months, I think by May or June. So stay tuned, keep on the email list, and you will see it when it happens. But I'm fascinated in this question, so I'm looking forward to running an event specifically on that too. So let's go to Elizabeth Dahl, one of my Zoom event managers. Elizabeth, unmute yourself. You have a minute to ask.
Thank you. So my question is probably mostly for Stephen and Rob. I am someone that lives in Washington State, so I tend to agree that we should have strong inter-party factions because I see those on a day-to-day basis. I'm sorry, Lee and Rob. In Washington State, we have a mainstream Republicans faction that has existed here since at least the 80s, a Freedom Caucus that is modeled after the National Freedom Caucus. And in the very recent past, we also had a quote unquote majority coalition caucus in which as many as 3 Democrats joined to caucus with the Republican side of the aisle to move legislation in our state legislature. With that in mind, I had kind of assumed that something similar existed in other states, but now I am wondering, can you guys speak to, one, is Washington unique in having that sort of an organization and firm inter-party factions? And 2, in trying to build inter-party factions, are you guys working, or do you know anyone that's working from the grassroots level to kind of change the activist class or the people that are actually involved in party apparatuses rather than just trying to connect with politicians or people on the more elite level, shall we say?
Thank you, Elizabeth. Steve, Rob.
Well, we actually, Elizabeth had a kind of similar dynamic here in Montana on the Republican side, where there was a group in the legislature that was calling themselves, they went by various different names, but most recently it was the Solutions Caucus, and I guess they preferred the term Conservative Solutions Caucus. They kept getting hit with the moderate label, which they didn't like. But so there was something like that going on here in Montana. It does seem to have faded a little bit since Republicans took control of basically everything in the state in this last election. I also believe, Steve, I think might know more about this, but isn't there something in Kansas that's kind of along these lines as well? So I think you do kind of see some of these things that still do exist in various states. One thing, though, that is not out there, to my knowledge, is anything linking, your folks in Washington with the people in Montana and what's going on in Kansas. So those linkages between these things at the state level aren't there, to my knowledge.
Yeah, and I'll just say something. I mean, Kansas, is a really interesting story, and I'm not sure I've gotten to the bottom of what was going on there, but Kansas used to be a state of people like Bob Dole, and sort of they had a very moderate Republican tradition, and there's still a lot of politicians who come out of that. For a while, it was sort of really taken over by a much more hard right kind of part of the Republican Party. And then, they had a big fiscal crisis that came as a result of tax cuts they did there. And then the moderate Republicans sort of got back in the driver's seat and helped to reverse it. I think in the 2020 elections, then the moderates took some hits. But one of the things, again, that I would emphasize, and this is where it does, again, get a little bit to some zero-sum choices, right? At the margin, dollars that you're spending trying to make institutional change are dollars you're not sending to moderate Republicans in Kansas, or you're not sending to moderate Republicans in Washington State, right? And this is where I'm frustrated by, again, this is partially just an issue I have with the donor class, right? That so much energy seems to be devoted to a particular definition of democracy reform, which is about institutional reform, right? As opposed to finding your people and throwing and sending them ammo. And so this is what I'm worried about is, there are in fact these fights between, and you see that on the Democratic side too, right? In Massachusetts, right? Or in cities like Minneapolis, right? A lot of the response, I think, in the aftermath to some of the policing changes that happened there was because there's so little organization of the less than hard left part of the party in some of these cities. And this is where, again, a lot of that donor money and energy and also people's own organizational activity really needs to be where there are actual fights here and now, walking here on planet Earth, between these more sort of extreme factions and moderate factions. And the only way to really win those is not to change the rules around, but actually to throw ammo to your allies.
Jeffrey Capaservice is in this room, I believe. Jeff, make note on this. This will probably be useful for your research. For those of you who don't know Jeff Capaservice, he's also at the Niskanen Center and does a lot of stuff on the history of the modern Republicans and all that kind of thing. So,
and Jeff knows all this Kansas stuff.
Yes, I do.
Jeff, we might bring you on for one of these in the near future then. So we'll see on that front. Okay, we're running in the last couple minutes here, so I'll get as many of you as I can into this. I can't promise that I'll get all of you, but I'll do my best. So let's go to Karen Fink. Karen.
Thanks. So this is a question for Steve or Rob. What is the incentive for these factions to work together at the national level when like moderates can be so easily punished through a primary where a minority of their party kicks them out because we don't have a system like ranked choice voting, because like a congressperson can be kicked out by a plurality vote, which doesn't represent a minority. Like that seems to be the system that we have, that people are actually punished for working together. So how under the existing system do we get around that and support this factionalization within parties that you're talking about?
Thank you, Karen. Steve, Rob?
Karen, do you mean working together with the other party or with other factions within the same party?
I mean, either. It seems like we're so polarized. Like if Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez compromises, I mean, she might not be the best example because she's probably pretty solid, but if she compromises with a moderate and people don't like that in her district, they can primary her out. Or if she compromises with Republicans,
Right. Can I just say a little bit on this? I mean, again, this is where I do think it's important to think about the importance of collective action. That one of the reasons why people get punished in that way, and you saw a lot of that in the Trump era, right, where somebody would sort of put their head up and say that Trump wasn't the greatest thing that ever happened, and then they'd get punished. You saw with Jeff Flake, in Arizona, who then chose not to run. Bob Corker chose not to run because he saw the writing on the wall. Part of the problem is it's really hard to do that differentiation as an individual, right? It's always easy to pick off those people when they're all by themselves. And one of the problems, especially with more moderate politicians, is they often run as having kind of, idiosyncratic brands that are just them, right? But one of the advantages of having collective action structures, right, is there are people to come to your aid when you're being attacked, right? There are people who can have, you know, money and organization and all those other things that the people with really intense preferences in primaries can often deploy. And now this is again where I think there's something, again, I'm in that position of like ranked choice voting, not as bad as I once thought it was. That I think there's something to ranked choice voting in that what I think it'll actually do is not weaken parties. I think it'll actually strengthen the existing parties, because I think what they'll do under conditions of ranked choice voting is actually do a lot of log rolling, right? The actual party apparatus, the actual party hacks who run the actual organization will in fact pick candidates, right? They will say, you know, we're in ranked choice voting world, right? But the party actually endorses this guy, right? In that sense, there'll be a much stronger pre-primary that will actually do a lot of this. And that I think that may actually weaken some of the more extremists who can actually get more leverage in a primary environment. So that's one reason why I think it's at least worth experimenting more with ranked choice voting, because it might actually have that effect. But I don't want to say that I have it. I'm super certain about that.
Let's take next question from Tom Mayer. Tom, unmute yourself. You have 1 minute.
Well, from a simplistic perspective and a limbic piece after having read Cast, I'm asking, does our focus on power for power's sake only come out of fear of 2042, which is the projected time of white minority?
Thank you, Tom. Lee, I think you might actually have an interesting response to that. Do you have any thoughts?
So, you know, I mean, there's a question here, which is that how much of our current, I mean, I think if I can expand on a riff on this is, you know, that fundamental stress point on American democracy at this moment is a sense that America is transitioning from a predominantly white Christian nation into a multi-ethnic, multi-racial nation. And, you know, that you know, I think puts a particular stress point on a group of white working class, non-college educated voters who, you know, feel tremendously under threat by that, because, you know, they see themselves being attacked, and, you know, they're told to check their white privilege, but they don't. They look around and they say, it sure doesn't feel like white privilege to me. It seems like everybody else is cutting ahead of me and getting privilege. You know, and that's a real anxiety. But, you know, within our political system, you know, there's a question of what you do with that. And, you know, do you throw gasoline on that fire, or do you figure out a way to manage it? And, you know, our current party system has evolved to the point where that a lot of those voters are in the Republican coalition. And, you know, the leadership of the Republican Party has a strong incentive to really kind of fan those flames to energize the party. And, you know, that is a very dangerous situation. Now, I mean, we haven't really discussed the challenges of a multi-ethnic democracy, which is, you know, I think a very important point. I think we're somewhat remiss in not addressing that in this conversation. You know, but I have thought a lot about that. And if you know, look at multi-ethnic democracies around the world, you know, you find that there are some that are more successful than others. And, you know, if you also look at the comparative politics literature, you find actually a lot of scholars who say, well, what are the right political institutions for multi-ethnic democracies? You know, and I think it's universally agreed that having a zero-sum, you know, a majoritarian winner-take-all system is very bad for diverse pluralist country, which, you know, I think we, you know, is, you know, in some ways should be obvious. So I think one important point there is that as we think about how our institutions should work, we have to build into the fact that we are entering an era in which we're trying to be a multi-ethnic democracy. And the way to be a successful multi-ethnic democracy is to have a political system that encourages cross-cutting coalitions. So here's another reason why I like ranked choice voting, is that it is a system that encourages people to go beyond their base of support to seek out second and third choice preferences. And it's one reason why a lot of folks who do sort of constitution writing, advising in divided society say actually after a divided society, ranked choice voting is a really good solution because it encourages that cross group coalition building.
Well, as oh yes, Steve.
I was going to say one real small thing on that, which is I have a very, as Feingold and Fines would say, I have a very short position on the declining white majority prediction, because so much of that is all contingent on what we think people of Hispanic descent will define themselves at in 40 years. And one thing we know is, one, there's very high graduation out of the Hispanic category, right? The Hispanic category is an ethnic category. It's not a racial category. And that lots of people who were Hispanics, or their parents were Hispanics, turn into white people in future generations. That is just white in the sense of how they identify on the census, and that's where the overwhelming percentage of the action demographics is. It's not that we're going to have a massively larger Asian population, a massively larger Black population. It's all contingent on what happens with Hispanics, right? And that's not a demographic prediction, that's a cultural and social construction prediction. And I think there's some evidence, right? If you think about those, those Hispanics who shifted over to Trump in 2020, a lot of those are Hispanics. I talked to a political consultant the day after this, and he said, that's the future of the Republican Party. It's Hispanics who think, no matter what the media is telling them, that they're white. Now, again, should they think that? Should they not think that is a whole other question. But I actually think building a lot of predictions about the future, about this idea that we're going to be profoundly more multiracial. I think we probably will be more multi-ethnic, but that's different than being multiracial. I think that distinction is pretty important.
Yeah, as somebody who myself is both multi-ethnic and a citizen of a democracy, this is a subject of near dear importance to my heart. And so I look forward to running an event on this specific topic as well. Because Lee and Steve are right, this is a really important and complicated kind of question here. So let's take one last question from Mimi Yang. Mimi, if you can keep it relatively short, and then we will go ahead and thank the speakers and send everybody out. But Mimi, ask your question real quick. This will be the last question of the night.
Look, thank you so much. One comment for you, look, quickly. I'm so happy to see the way you run the sessions, because you lead us beyond the polarities, beyond the binaries. So we get into the epistemological nuances. So I think I really, each time I see your name, I just want to attend the session. So please, good job. I'm so happy.
Thank you, Mimi. Now, what's your question?
Question for first. Yeah, my question is very quick. On one hand, both the Democrats and the Republicans within parties, they are internally, are you hearing me? Are you hearing me?
You're having
internally divisive, internally divisive, internally diverse. What is the force that is so congruent, still keep them together as two holistic parties? Conversely, we have had parties like the Reform Party, Libertarian, Socialist, Green parties, Constitution parties. What are them becoming a significant influence? So that's my question.
So Mimi, you were having some audio issues, but I think we got the gist of it. So so to Steve, to Lee, and to Rob, what is the force that keeps the two parties diverse so they are together? And then on the opposite side of that, what is it that keeps smaller parties from coming in. Just let's do a quick lightning round and then we'll finish this up.
Well, what keeps them together is the threat of the other party taking power, and what keeps third parties from succeeding is our first past the post system of voting.
Yep. And that's all I got to say on that is I think that's the first thing that we've had 100% congruence on, right? And I think part of it is, right, parties are always teams of people who can agree at a minimum that they should be the one organizing the political system and not the other guy, right? And again, that's why they believe that has changed over time. If you went back over 100 years, it was that they thought that they wanted their party to distribute the spoils of politics, right? The jobs and who was the postmaster of Des Moines and all that, right? And today, right, it's more ideological or policy. And again, I do think as we have factionalized parties on particular policy issues, they'll want to govern with the other party in ways that Luke was talking about earlier, but they'll still at the margin more want their party with all of its own conflict rather than the other party. And I think that's what is still going to keep some glue together of these party coalitions.
And Rob, I see you unmuted yourself.
Yeah, no, yep, I agree. Don't have anything to add.
Well, it is always great to end events that have this level of rich disagreement on a small note of agreement in full. So so I'm happy that we were able to get to there while still being able to have this deep and interesting and diverse level of just all the other trends that were here. So, well, on behalf of the America's Public Forum program and on behalf of Braver Angels, I'd like to thank Lee Drutman, Steve Teles, and Rob Saldin for joining us tonight for this event. If you all know what jazz hands are, that's our tradition here. So join me in giving them a round of jazz hands for this. But Lee, Steve, Rob, thank you very much for joining us. I know that I enjoyed this conversation and found myself learning new things and going down some different rabbit holes of questioning as well. And I hope that the same was true of others in this in the audience, and maybe some of those who will watch this on YouTube pretty shortly. So I'd also like to thank real quick the Zoom event managers who've been running things behind the scenes very well: Elizabeth Dahl, Ibrahim Onley, and Dennis Smith. Thank you all. We couldn't do this without you. And lastly, I'd like to thank you all in the audience who took some time out of your primetime slot on a Wednesday night to come listen to political scientists talk about what's wrong with the American party system. Because this is the kind of conversation that a lot of people, when they talk about the decline in American public discourse, worry that isn't happening enough, right? This kind of levels of engagement between people on different sides of the political aisle, people with very different opinions about how the political system should be solved, and people from just very different backgrounds, intellectually, socially, culturally, educationally, all that kind of thing. And what we at Braver Angels have been committed to doing for as long as we've been around and as long as we are around is bridging those divides and opening ways for Americans who have plenty of reasons to not like each other, to find reasons to even learn from each other and find ways to maybe even work with each other on various things. There's obviously a lot of ways that the conversation that we had tonight with the help of Steve and Lee and Rob on the way the political system influences that, there's a lot of ways in which it's relevant to there, but it's relevant in so many other ways as well. And so with that, I would just like to go ahead and do some final pitches. So Ibrahim and Elizabeth, if you two can go ahead and put the links to the books and links to the Twitter handles in the chat, please. You can follow Rob's and Lee's engagements on Twitter with their fellow political scientists and journalists at their Twitter handles that should be going up in the chat in just a moment here. That's at Lee Drutman and at Rob Saldin. And you can follow some of the arguments that they've been making here in their books. So Lee's book is Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop, the case for multi-party democracy in America, and Steve and Rob's book is Never Trump, the Revolt of the Conservative Elites. And you can also follow their work as well in a variety of magazines in the DC the DC Policy Circuit think tank. I always make sure to read them whenever I see any of their names in print because they're always worth reading. Even when I don't even know what I think about what they're writing, but I always learn from it and it's always useful and enlightening. So just a recommendation there. So meantime, if you like what you saw tonight, if you enjoyed this conversation, if you think that there are other conversations of this sort that might be valuable and might be useful, I invite you on behalf of the whole Braver Angels community to follow our work. And you can follow our work by going to braverangels.org and signing up on the newsletter, and even signing up to be a member, and especially signing up to be a volunteer. We work on volunteer support here in all of our events and all of our programming. We are a dispersed national network organization that does a lot of this kind of stuff, not only at the national level, but at every community level as well. And if you are ever looking for a way to get involved with your fellow Americans across the red-blue divide and find ways not only to think about these kinds of things, but to operationalize these kinds of things in your communities, even to the point of thinking about this in practical politics, Braver Angels is a place for you. There are alliances all over the country and various working groups doing various national things that we're always looking for help with. For what it's worth, I'm looking for help now as well. The America's Public Forum program is in its official infancy, and we are going to be growing this over the course of the next several months. And so if you'd like to help me and Elizabeth and Ibrahim and Dennis put on these events, you're very welcome to volunteer in Braver Angels, and you might find your way to our team. So, so with that, there's just, I want to thank again Steve and Lee and Rob for coming on this and for doing this conversation, because this is an important conversation to have. As you can tell from what was said, there's a bajillion other ways it can go. And maybe we'll have some of those ways on this forum in future sessions. We shall see. But meantime, Steve, Lee, Rob, thank you for coming and sharing your insights and wisdom on this. And thank you for engaging with us. And everybody else, thank you for being here and being a part of this, this conversation with us. And I look forward to seeing you on America's Public Forum events in the very near future. So thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful evening.